Mount Makeley.
Thank you, Acting Speaker. And I rise to speak on the Education and Training Reform Regulation of Student Accommodation Bill 2020. And it's a shame that we have to have these amendments, but it is a very good bill. And it's very gratifying to see that members across the House support this amendment. It's an important bill that addresses a recommendation of the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, and in doing so continues the important work being undertaken by previous governments and of course the Andrews Labor government in implementing its recommendations and attempting to eliminate one of the scourges of our society. The Royal Commission made clear that our boarding schools can be a high-risk environment for students, and as other members have said, 1 in 3 people who reported their abuse had experienced it in boarding schools. One case of child abuse in our society is a tragic abomination, and there are far, far too many stories in our Victorian history. And anything we can do to stamp out these crimes, especially, and as in this case, in our school environments, is well worth doing. As I mentioned, I'm proud to see that members across the House are supporting this, and I note that the messages from each of the members are very similar, that we won't tolerate this, we need to stamp this out. Growing up in the 70s and 80s, I think as a member for Hawthorn mentioned from his experience about boarding schools, you knew which members not to be left alone with. So, you know, he referred to, if you can put yourself in back to when we were all younger and you're living a life where you know you don't want to be caught alone with that person. And that's a terrible fact that children in our history of this state have had to live with. A member for Box Hill mentioned a woman's name, who I'm just not even going to mention because she doesn't deserve it. And I know the member for Caulfield here has had a very strong advocacy on attempting to right the wrongs that were done there. I support those efforts to bring that woman back to answer for the allegations. This bill amends the Education and Training Reform Act of 2006 to expand the powers of regulation of the Victorian Registration and Qualifications Authority in regard to the regulation and registration of Victorian school boarding premises. The intention of this is to ensure that these premises are child-safe environments. In regard to specifics, I'll expand the powers of the VRQA to regulate school boarding premises, require registration of school boarding premises with the VRQA, prescribe minimum standards for registration of school boarding premises, including in relation to Victorian child safe standards, set out processes for reviewing the compliance of school boarding premises with the prescribed minimum standards for registration, and provide the VRQA with necessary compliance and enforcement powers to ensure school boarding premises satisfy the minimum standards. Now, as others have mentioned, a number of these school boarding premises were under the opinion they already had to comply, and that's great, that's good, but it is, nobody has said all of them yet, so let's make sure that they all do. These amendments are being made today for many reasons, but first and foremost, they will support and reinforce the obligation of schools with boarding premises to exercise their duty of care on the students and young Victorians in their care. Now, one would have thought that whilst common law obligations would have been sufficient for that, as the Royal Commission has obviously shown us, that has not always been the case. So these amendments are about creating a regulatory system to prevent abuse by creating an obligation for schools to establish the right policies, procedures and conduct to keep our children safe. School boarding premises will be required to comply with the prescribed minimum standards for registration in the Act and education, training and reform regulations. And in doing so, it's worth pointing out that this will be consistent with already existing registration requirements for schools. And as most of the boarding premises are attached to schools, this shouldn't be an excessive regulatory burden more than what they already have. And as I previously said, if most of them already think they are doing it, then it's not going to be excessive red tape or any issues like that. Some of the prescribed minimum standards for registration of schools are in the Act, but the bulk of these standards are prescribed in the regulations. And in regard to the registration of school boarding premises, this will be the same. That makes sense. It relies to discipline of students, managing the risk of anaphylaxis and presumably other severe allergies, and managing the risk of child abuse. I'm lucky enough, Beck and I are lucky enough to have 3 kids of young ages. They're all going to school. And, you know, my youngest is still young enough that, you know, it's quite likely when you come home it's daddy, daddy, and throws your arms around him. To think that people who place their children in the care of others and have that trust betrayed, it's an abominable thing. And to consider that lives are changed permanently by this, and the member for Burwood talked about the survivors who came forward, and I can imagine that is a very, very difficult thing to do. But by hearing their stories, by understanding what they had to endure, that is what has made change after change. I'm sure the member for Broadmeadows will explain some of his interactions with the Betrayal of Trust report. I look forward to hearing those, as the member for Thomastown and others have alluded to that as well. I thank Prime Minister Gillard for instigating this Royal Commission. Step by step, we are working to get rid of this problem in our society. And again, it is very gratifying that we're doing that together. So, the schools are currently required to comply with a ministerial order for managing the risk of child abuse as part of the prescribed minimum standards for registration of schools. And that prescribed minimum standards for the registration in this bill includes compliance with the ministerial order for managing the risk of child abuse. I think one thing I've noticed has changed since the 70s or 80s when I grew up is that we're talking about it now. I'm sure, as the member for Hawthorn alluded to, growing up we heard stories, knew of things, but it wasn't something that was out in the public. It wasn't something that you would talk about, that you deal with at a governmental level. We've changed in that way. That's a really good thing, and we need to keep working on that change, not only for protecting our children from abusive adults, but also protecting our children from racism, poverty, homelessness, drug addiction. Every child who was abused grew up to be an adult if they were lucky. Not all of them grew up. It's our role to reduce the number down to 0. I commend the bill to the House.